Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the faculty panel. This is the policy and history panel where you have the opportunity to ask questions about the Mises University, its classes, its content, things that were covered, maybe things that weren't covered, questions that you had that you didn't get to ask, or questions that you want to put the faculty on the spot for. But someone will be going around the room with a microphone so that you can stand up and ask your question. You can direct it at a particular faculty member. Otherwise, it's a general question to our faculty. And again, the topic of this session is policy and history. So real world oriented things. The next panel, which of course you will also see, is another panel of faculty, and the questions there will be geared towards economic theory and economic methodology. So with that, let's begin.
This question is for anybody. I'm curious what you think is the state that's gotten the closest to ideal libertarian Misesian status throughout all of history.
So, this is on. All right. I know there's, we could talk about various sort of anarcho-capitalist societies that, have existed. I guess I'd bring up, this is nowhere close to that, but something Rothbard always liked to talk about, and I like to talk about, is the United States in the 1830s and the 1840s, because it wasn't perfect, but the Jacksonian Democrats, they got rid of the central bank, right? They instituted an independent treasury. They instituted free trade tariffs, right, which were, just to raise revenue. They were not designed to be protectionist. They'd paid off the national debt at one point, kept internal improvements, federally funded internal improvements to a minimum. At the state level, they had instituted various types of free banking laws, making it easier to open up a bank. Also, general incorporation laws, making it easier to open up a corporation. So at the very beginning of For New Liberty, Murray Rothbard, with maybe a little bit of exaggeration, he says, they reduced the state. The Jacksonians reduced the state to the size of an atom, something like that. So I think in terms of a significant country, at least in relative history, this is something I like to point out as though there actually were, some serious moves to the free market that did benefit the country.
Well, that's something. The American West, when it was being settled before when there were territories and not states, the wagon trains and the people that were going out there often had their own constitutions, their own laws, their own private police. When there were cattle rustlers stealing people's cows, they hired sharpshooters to police the cattle thieves. And so I don't know if your question is aimed at that, but there was communities of people forming their own more or less private governments. Read the Not So Wild Wild West by Anderson and Hill in the Journal of Libertarian Studies sometime in the late 1970s. And that would be one example. And even in today's world, I was not too long ago, some of the tiny countries in the world, like I was not too long ago in St. Lucia, and because it's tiny, they don't have a central bank. And they had crooked politicians. Gas was $17 a gallon because it's a government monopoly. All the gas stations are run by the government. But still, compared to us, that's a great deal of freedom in a small place like that.
For the panel, what kind or form of tax is the most destructive?
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry. What kind of what?
What kind or form of, I should say, direct tax is the most destructive? So tariffs, income, corporation, excise, sin, any of the types?
It was already on. I actually think investment taxes are the most destructive because they do demotivate savings and investment, and they push people into consumption. And yeah, if I could identify one more than the others, I'd point the finger at that.
On that one, James Buchanan and Jeffrey Brennan wrote a book many years ago. I can't remember the name of it, but you can find it on the web or on Amazon. And they made a case that excise taxes are much preferred to income taxation, and they probably would put tariffs in there because you can always escape somehow. You don't have to buy the excise taxed product. They're not uniform. They're never uniform excise taxes on everything. And so, and for that, when their book was reviewed in the Economic Journal, which is a well-known British economics journal, the author of the review called them fascists for that.
Yeah, just along those lines. I mean, to answer your question, like a narrow tax just on Rothbard's writings would probably be the most destructive of all. But if in terms of the standard categories, going along with what Tom said, a huge thing like is people talk about, well, what if, they shifted away from income tax and towards tariffs? If you could do it fully so that all they had were tariffs in place and got rid of the IRS, I would take that in a heartbeat because, like Tom's saying, number one, that they couldn't possibly raise the same amount of revenue because people would just buy domestically. So that kind of has an inbuilt escape valve. But other than that, if you're doing an income tax, a lot of it is just you're telling the government all your business, like literally, right? Whereas if it's just they're charging a duty at the border, it's just, it's a percentage thing that they're not having to get into all your affairs. So in the what's that guy's name? The French guy that came out with the tax. Yes, Thomas Piketty. This isn't like we're reading between the lines. He explicitly says in his book, the reason for having confiscatory, and I think he even uses that word, income taxes is partly just to make sure that the ultra rich have to report all their activities. Like it's a data collection method besides just raising revenue. Like they know at super high rates, they're not bringing in a lot of revenue. It's just they want to keep tabs on what all these rich people are doing. So for all those reasons the income tax, and like Dave said, it discourages savings as well. So an income tax or like a corporate income tax graduated is just absolutely terrible on like five different reasons.
This one's for Dr. Newman. So recently I was at the George Mason Public Outreach Conference, and a lot of the economists there were talking about how the Constitution is one of the best governing documents. And I know you kind of point out there's a lot of crony stuff that went on in there, but one kind of seem, compared to other countries, it still seems like the United States is on top. And we do have the longest running Constitution right now in history. So if the Constitution was just crony, why does it seem to have limited the government more effectively than other systems of government?
Yeah, it's a great question, and this is frequently brought up when you could have libertarian criticisms of the Constitution. They'd say, well, it seems like it's worked pretty good. My argument or my response to that would be it's the strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution that's what's made it great, right? So if you look what the Federalists were able to do by the end of the 1790s. It wouldn't look like that good of a governing system, right? At least from our perspective, you almost had a quasi-military state taking over. Former Secretary of the Treasury was Inspector General, of the military. You had a central bank. You had protective tariffs. All of this stuff. We were careening toward a war with France, but it was the Jeffersonians when they took over to kind of not necessarily bring it back to its intention. That's what they would argue, but it's to sort of make it a limited governing document, excuse me. And same thing with the Jacksonians and so on. So there's I guess what I'm saying is there's a difference between the Constitution and the constitutional or the libertarian constitutional tradition that came after that. Right. And so I think it's very important to distinguish that. So, the Constitution is better than other systems where you just have a dictator, right? Or there is no rule of law. But the point is that the Constitution, given some of those structural issues that I've mentioned regarding general welfare, necessary and proper, the ability to have basically a standing army, the ability to pass laws with a simple majority has prevented it, has basically prevented it from doing any sort of real restraining. So we need to distinguish, I guess just to conclude, we need to distinguish between the Jeffersonians, the Jacksonians, the Cleveland Democrats, some Republicans in the 20th century that were able to strategically argue that the Constitution is a limited, a limited government document, and the Constitution as it was intended by the Federalists. At least that's my response.
I'd like to add to that since I'm closest to the microphone, that after the Civil War, Woodrow Wilson, well, he came long after. He was a president for a while, you might recall. He was a professor at Princeton for years. He was a president at Princeton. He wrote a book on the Constitution, and he celebrated the fact that one of the things the American Civil War did was it established the fact that everyone's freedom would be in the hands of 5 government lawyers working for the federal government with lifetime tenure. In other words, the Supreme Court would be the sole arbiter of constitutionality. It wasn't like that. Andrew Jackson vetoed the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States, and he pretty much thumbed his nose at everybody else, the Congress, everybody, the court, over that. And that happened frequently before the Civil War. And so that was a fundamental change in the Constitution. It wasn't the same Constitution ever after that, because before that, it was the assumption that the government was to be the servant of the people, not the masters of the people. That changed when the rights of secession and nullification were destroyed by the Civil War, where the people could no longer organize very well or at all at the state and local level to protest or to defeat blatantly unconstitutional laws. It was all determined by 5 government lawyers in creepy-looking black robes.
Okay, so on the Constitution again, and if you permit me, 3 quite brief questions. So the first one is, just one question. Okay, so Maya Rothbard has been quoted as finding the Constitution, that is the current Constitution of the United States, to be something that came out of a bloodless coup. Do you care to share with me whether the preceding Constitution, that is the Articles of Confederation, contained an outright prohibition of constitutional replacement?
You're arguing if, like, how did the Articles of Confederation propose amendments, basically, right? And they did have a system for that. It was that it required not only the Confederation Congress to approve it, but it required the state legislatures to approve it. So each state, there were 13 states at the time, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Georgia, et cetera. The state legislatures, which were elected by the people, had to approve the amendment. So in theory, you could have replaced the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution. There was a legal way of doing that. Each of the state legislatures had to approve it, right? But they didn't do that. They knew it couldn't get passed if they did that. So instead they said, well, we'll go for 9 out of 13 of the states have to approve it. And it didn't even have to be the state legislatures. It were these separate state conventions that you had various representatives, like the people could vote on representatives to go to the state convention. So it was outside of the Articles amendment process. So it was, strictly speaking, it was a coup. A new government was created outside of the existing governing bodies' sort of rules and procedures, right?
So the legality of assisted suicide has been in the news recently. I wondered if any of you have a libertarian case against assisted suicide, or if you all believe that it fits within like a libertarian framework.
I've been asked about it since my talk. Is this presenting? Okay. I've been asked about that and some other oddball cases, and I had to tell the student I don't know a lot about assisted suicide, but and I don't know what would be the libertarian case for or against it. But I got asked, more than one person asked me about it since the repugnant markets talk, and in a completely free libertarian world, there would be still some things that are illegal because they're violations of people's rights. And I mean, that's not exactly what I was talking about. I was talking about what are the consequences when we ban things because they're not really a violation of rights, but when they are considered repugnant or gross or whatever. And so that's something being offensive. It's not the same thing as being a violation of rights. And so, I don't have an answer for your question, but, there are some things that have always been banned for one reason or another. Murray Rothbard talks about, what about if shoes have always been produced by the government and now we talk about privatizing that, and what would this look like? You can imagine Murray says you could imagine the objections that we would get to that. Oh, you're against poor people having shoes and those kinds of responses. Who would produce the shoes? Where would they be, and would they be in the right sizes? And so, we don't know how these markets are going to play out if they've always been banned before. But, entrepreneurs are very creative. They have a reason a motivation, incentive to figure it out, to do it in the right way. So I've gotten asked that this week about assisted suicide, and I don't know a lot about it, but I imagine entrepreneurs in that line of work would, they would insist on, for protecting themselves and their own reputation, they would insist on psychological evaluations, some waiting period before you're allowed to do that, because this company doesn't certainly want to be accused of murdering their clients. And so, I don't have an answer for it. I don't know, Bob.
Yes. So just a couple quick points on that, like Sandy's saying, it's even like in standard libertarian law. There's things about like you have to be able to give consent. And so like if somebody were just half asleep and you held a contract in front of them that said, I give you my estate for $1, and the person kind of half asleep signed it, you wouldn't say, oh, too bad you live in libertarian land, because now that's legally binding. You know what I mean? Like there's some room for the person has to know what they're doing. And likewise, besides assisted suicide, like there's crazy cases. I don't know if this is on your guys' radar, like of people who will go to their doctor and say, I feel like I'm supposed to be a blind person, and they ask for them to like gouge their eyes out or blind them because that's like who they're supposed to be. So, in a case like that, you could say, well, in libertarian land, what would happen there? At the very least, I would think like the companies giving malpractice insurance and stuff to doctors would say, yeah, we don't want to be involved with this person. So I think short of just the police showing up and throwing you in a cage, there would be all sorts of, legal or professional ramifications that would disincentivize stuff like that. And then also just the last thing I'll say, though, in today's world, like, in the statist context, the reason this kind of stuff horrifies me is because, like in Canada, if you're viewed as a burden on the taxpayer, there's going to be all sorts of incentives for the doctors to get the notice from on high that, yeah, we got to cut down on medical costs. So somebody's 75 years old, and at this point, they're not contributing. They're just burning up social capital. Figure out how to have a talk with them and let them know the right thing to do. That kind of, which is just, that's not a road you want to go down.
Certain states have laws saying that you can't discriminate against someone when hiring based on their political beliefs. All right. Now, imagine if, for example, one of these states then made an exception saying that, well, actually, you can discriminate against someone if they politically believe in libertarianism or Austrian economics, something that, just beliefs that our group generally has. Now, what I wanted to ask the panel is whether or not you would support or be against such exemptions or policies or the like, because while, for example, they do give people more property rights, in terms of who they're allowed to employ or not, such laws would only really be going against those who are actually against, the big bureaucracy, federal government expansion, stuff like that.
You have a right to believe in pro-government policies, and you have the right to be a statist, and so you'd have the right to only hire people who believe in statist views, just like if you were a libertarian, you have the right to only hire people who believe with your views, right? That's That's the market, I'd say.
Sounds like the American university.
Yeah, I was going to say, is your question saying if some state passed a law saying businesses aren't allowed to discriminate against Rothbardians, would we say, all right, finally, or would we oppose that and say, no, technically, is that what your question is?
No, what I'm saying is that some states, they already don't allow you to discriminate based on political beliefs. What if then one of the states said, hey, we're proposing a new law, basically saying, okay, well, now we're making an exception. You can discriminate against Rothbardians.
I mean, if you're asking me, I would probably, is this thing on? I would probably say the true statement is that, yeah, this is ridiculous. Of course, we all know what's going on here. This is incredibly unfair, but strictly speaking, sure, go ahead and, all 18 of us are going to be really upset.
Hi, for the entire panel, what do you think would be like the single hardest obstacle or hurdle that we would have to go through in order to install a libertarian society? Would it be getting rid of the central bank? Would it be changing the majority of the people, like mindset and stuff like that? Or installing or selling private justice and policing? What do you think about that? Thanks.
So when I think about this question, I go to the source of where the funding comes for the government, because ultimately it can't really do anything unless it has money to pay the bills and support itself. So then the funding sources are primarily taxation or issuing debt or monetizing that debt by creating money. So if you eliminate the central bank, or at least hamstring it so that it can't control the money supply. A good case in point is maybe like in Argentina, that's a policy that's on the table. Dollarize the economy so that the Argentine central bank can't control the money supply, and that neutralizes the government's ability to be oppressive. Or reform the tax code, or at least keep it at a minimum level, or get rid of taxes completely, but keep taxes at a sufficiently low level, because that hamstrings the government and the ability to pursue policy.
Massive decentralization would be my pick. For example, if people of Eastern Washington State currently want to secede from Washington State and become a part of Idaho, which is much more conservative, and then maybe they'll get sick of that and want to just have their own little country, Eastern Washington. And then if you had, you would have to get rid of the mindset in Americans, in this country anyway, that secession is is treason or something that can't happen. And if we could be more like the European city-states of the hundreds of years ago, there's a relatively high degree of freedom there, because you could, if your government becomes tyrannical, it was relatively easy to move to another place where there was more freedom. So I wouldn't think in terms of a libertarian society, but moving in the direction toward a freer society. And, don't think of it's either a utopia or what we have today.
Just one more to add to that. I think that an intellectually inquisitive society questions the government, questions forms of authority, and intellectually lazy societies are conformist and go along with that. And I think as a beneficial goal, keeping people intellectually curious is beneficial in minimizing the role of the state.
Yeah, just real. I realize. I think your question was, "What's the biggest obstacle?" And we're kind of giving you solutions, but I mean, so I think to me, the thing that's shocked me the most is how much people will, like, they know what they want the answer to be, and they'll figure out what the argument is to give them that answer. And how transparently they'll do that. Like even intelligent, people who make arguments for a living, kind of thing. So But then, having said all that, that's why I'm agreeing with Tom that I used to play with all sorts of different things in terms of policy, but now in terms of like a practical thing that also I think could possibly work in my lifetime that's why I'm all in. I don't call it secession. I call it Texas independence. So.
Okay. Well, my question is, what is the original meaning of a well-regulated militia in the Second Amendment, especially from a point of view of the anti-federalist, and how was that phrase understood at the time?
Well, in that period of history, well-regulated meant well-trained. You know how to use guns. it didn't, because there were no federal regulatory agencies at the time that the Constitution was being written. And so, and James Madison is known as, have had a lot of input in the Second Amendment to the Constitution. And he believed it was necessary to defend against an invasion of any state by the federal government in the future. If you had a well-armed community, Lincoln proved him wrong, of course, because military technology outstripped any belief that they could have that people could protect themselves with rifles against cannons or 150,000 men armies, that sort of thing. But the word regulated meant well-trained. It didn't mean government regulation.
Yeah, I was just going to briefly add, the big fear at the time was a federal government with the power, which had a standing army, right? And so it's thought that, well, the best way of confronting that possibility was having, like a state level militias or individual, like the rights to bear arms and so on. So it was a very decentralist view of the Second Amendment. Again, it was not really directed against criminals per se. It was directed against the government, right? Yeah.
A lot of people think that why the Nazis sort of left Switzerland alone was that the Swiss were all heavily armed. Every single adult was trained in firearm use then as today.
Just on that point real quickly, I had a history professor when I was a student at Hillsdale, this guy from Russia with a real thick accent that I'm not going to try to reproduce here. And he said when he was visiting Switzerland one time and this guy showed him in his garage and under like a tarp, he had a tank. And the guy's telling us, he goes, they had tanks. And yeah, anyway, so go ahead.
Dr. Patrick Newman, what do you make of Jon Hasnas' argument that the idea of the rule of law and not of men is inherently problematic because of the natural subjectivity of language? And does this pose a problem for libertarian law as much as it clearly poses for the state's law? Thank you.
What was the natural subjectivity of? Why is it inherently
language?
Oh,
yes, he argued that language allows for multiple different interpretations of it, and then multiple different judges or law enforcement officers are thus able to interpret the same body of law very differently, leading to different outcomes.
well, that I guess it would get into like a strict constructionist or a broad constructionist interpretation. Yeah, you can always read into something a certain way. It depends on how the law is written. I mean, to say like a rule of law is problematic would be, I mean, you'd say from a libertarian perspective, at least from a Rothbardian perspective, you would say, well, that stems from natural rights, right, and natural law. So what do those terms mean? And if things are clearly stated, then there are then I don't really see how there would be a problem. I mean, of course, judges have interpreted the law, like how like the rule of law or common law, et cetera, sort of evolved, was not through government statute, but through judges interpreting things. But over time, I mean, this process led to, I would say, fairly clear instances of at least regarding certain things, like what should be illegal, what should not be illegal. But I mean, yeah, there's different, like language can be broad, but I think there is a, there are, you can define things to be pretty strict. Otherwise, then contracts would be very problematic, I guess. And I don't know what he says about that. I don't know if anyone.
Well, in The Road to Serfdom, Hayek writes that the important thing is whatever the law is should apply equally to everybody. That's the rule of law. And you're right. In the U.S., it was Alexander Hamilton who first started destroying the Constitution. He invented the idea of implied powers of the Constitution, and he threw out the theory even of resulting powers, which says if the government does something that is unconstitutional, the fact that it got away with doing it makes it constitutional. And that's where we are today, isn't it? But that was Alexander Hamilton back in the 1700s saying that. And so that began as soon as the ink was dry on the Constitution, that the reinterpretation began. But Hayek, if you read that, that's one of Hayek's arguments about why planning destroys the rule of law, is that it inevitably benefits one group at the expense of another. And so that destroys the whole idea of equal protection under the law, because it makes it inherently incompatible with government planning, is his argument.
So we had some talks about fractional reserve banking this week. So I was wondering if, is this a practice that ought to be prohibited? Is it something that you can sue, like take to court over, or is this something that should be allowed if the contracts are done correctly?
Yeah, I view fractional reserve banking in a free society as something that's definitely illegal. And in common law regimes, like in the U.S., the contracts are not enforceable as they currently stand, and they couldn't really be designed to be enforceable for a couple of different reasons. Like, an unenforceable contract arises when you have what's called incompatible clauses. So from depositors' points of view, they're undertaking a contract for a deposit. From the bank's point of view, they're treating that deposit as a loan, and those two ends are fundamentally at odds with one another, so the contract is unenforceable. Or you have impossible to fulfill contracts. Those are also illegal or non-binding, and so under current legal regimes. And so here you have a case where you've got full access to your money at all times, but the bank can't possibly honor that promise. And that becomes clear if you have a bank run or a bank insolvency, and so the contract is not enforceable under that. So Sandy said it earlier, but just because you're in a free society doesn't mean that you don't have laws, and laws exist for all sorts of reasons, but it's also important that they're logically founded, that the building parts of the laws are all dovetail with one another's, and fractional reserve banking contracts they're not logically consistent internally.
Yeah, just real quick on this stuff, just to go along with what Dave's saying. I know you and I have talked, so I know you know this, but just for the broader group, I think it's a misconception. Like, a lot of people sometimes on Twitter be like, yeah, Murray Rothbard talked a big game, but he wanted the government to outlaw fractional reserve banking. And I don't think that's accurate. I think, as he's saying, it's more like Rothbard thought in a free society, contracts would be enforced, and the nature of what a demand deposit is means that's what they'd have to be doing. So it's not that there'd be this special regulation that, oh yeah, we got to insist on 100% reserves. It would just be that, banks can't violate what the agreement was in his framework. And just real quickly, just to kind of understand where people are coming from, the distinction, if you go read Huerta de Soto, it's like the difference between a bailment contract and a loan. And so when people put their money into a checking account, they're not thinking, I'm lending my money to the bank. That's not what they're thinking. They'll even say, yeah, I went to the bank to get my money, or, oh no, they don't have my money, right? You see what I'm saying? So that's just the way they're thinking about it. Even if they signed something that said, I'm getting paid interest. And if you ask them, well, how are they able to pay you interest? They would, ultimately admit that, yeah, I realize they must be doing something with it. And the last thing I'll just say is, like, imagine, you go to dinner and you check your coat, right? Like, it's a fancy restaurant. You take your coat off and they give you a little ticket. It wouldn't be enough if the people running that said, oh yeah, we're lending the coats out to people on the street who are cold, but don't worry, we're pretty sure when you show up with that ticket, we'll have your coat for you. And so long as, and until you catch us unable to fulfill that, you can't be upset with us, or we're not violating, you know what I mean? That would obviously be crazy. That's not what the understood deal was. And it's not that to rule that out in a free society, we would need Rothbard to say, we need to outlaw the fractional reserve lending of coats at dinner time. It's just saying, no, you got to do what people understood you to be doing.
Hi, this is for the panel. It seems Austrian economics is the shortest path to real prosperity. So my question is, right now, what are the hurdles that are getting in the way from expanding the Austrian School of Thought?
I don't see any hurdles. You see a hurdle, Bob?
Well, right now there's not too many bathrooms here, so we've kind of hit the capacity for Misesian.
We are working on fundraising for a new building, so that'll be a hurdle.
Yeah, maybe.
Did you want a serious answer?
Yeah. I guess so, right?
I can comment maybe from an academic point of view. There's some hurdles academically speaking. Most departments aren't, and increasingly most universities, or even all universities, are not the most free market oriented. And so, for academics, you're working in an atmosphere where you're on the defensive in large part. Hiring committees are also aware of this, and so when you're going up looking for academic type jobs, it's an upward battle to get a department that's willing to accept you. And research funding is also commonly contingent on coming up with solutions to problems, and normally solutions that appeal to people without thinking about it too much are status type solutions that superficially seem like quick, easy fixes. But that's just on the academic side of things.
I would add to that there's an intertangling of the state and the academy, where the academy has become a kind of an apologist for the state, and you can understand why this is if you look at how many economists are employed by government bureaucracies. I mean, if you wanted to be a monetary macroeconomist and you decide you hate the Fed, you've just removed yourself from large numbers of jobs working in and around the central bank, and so part of the problem is just this kind of interest group entanglement that the universities have gotten themselves into. And Austrian economics is not very good at ingratiating itself with the state. I mean, Mises had to leave his home country while the government burned his books, because he had said things that were at odds with what the state wanted to do. And if you really want to progress in your career as an academic economist, it's generally a strike against you if you in your progress in getting grants and so forth, if you've taken the positions that Austrian economists tend to take.
Maybe if I could just make one more comment about that. The future is always in the hands of young people, because old people die and then that's kind of the end of them. But young people grow up to become older people, and intellectual curiosity for young people is really important to get them to seek answers that are actually honest and true. So I told a joke to somebody earlier this week that, I just finished reading a world history of all the wars that have ever been fought, and the good guys won every single war. And I thought that was such an incredibly uplifting story, because what are the odds? And it made me incredibly optimistic for the future. And so unless you're intellectually curious, you would read that, and even an educated person would read that and think that, and accept it at face value. And you really have to have a curiosity to dive deeper. And young people, we need to foster that environment where young people can be intellectually curious and free to dig deeper at these questions and not accept truths at face value.
Mises said the universities of his day, he called them nurseries of socialism, but then he also said that there's always a remnant of young people who are curious, like Dave is speaking about, and that's you. Yeah, you're the remnant of people who don't buy into whatever they're told by their status professors. And the Fed is also insidious in this regard. They employ about 500 PhD economists at the Fed headquarters, and they invite hundreds to their conferences all the time. And Larry H. White, there's two Larry Whites in the economics profession. They're both old now, but Larry H. White, who taught at George Mason, did a study some years ago, and he found that I think it was 74% of all journal articles in monetary journals were published by people, either a Fed employee or somebody who was paid by the Fed in some way. And Milton Friedman once said, if you want a career as a monetary economist, it's a good idea not to criticize the main employer in your field. And so they have sort of a censorship type of ability at the Fed. I think Murray Rothbard, I'm told, once said that your typical American monetary economist would stab his mother to death with a fork for an invitation to a Fed conference.
My question is for all the panel. If fractional reserve banking is incompatible with sound money and leads to economic distortions, how can Austrian economists propose a realistic transition towards a fully backed reserve system, given today's political constraints and global resilience on credit?
Yeah, actually, as a quick answer to that, during the financial crisis, the penultimate financial crisis, banks were actually over-reserved for a period of time, and the transition would have been incredibly easy at that moment in time because the reserve requirement could have been set to 100%, and it would have required no adjustment process whatsoever, and so that was an easy fix that was lost. You can either be a gradualist on this and oblige banks to gradually increase their reserves, or you could be, a little bit more cutthroat and just enforce it at the drop of a hat. And I don't know which the best path forward is, but we did have an opportunity very close in time to where we are today, and it was missed.
Let me just make sure everyone's not getting the wrong idea here, that especially there's certain people who are pro-fractional reserve on the internet that will make it sound like this is some crankish Rothbardian thing that 18 guys in a phone booth believe. And no, I mean, like Irving Fisher has a book on 100% reserve banking, the Chicago School guy, right? So there's a long tradition of this. This isn't some mere thing that, a few Rothbardians believe in. And also even after the 2008 crisis, two of the guys that won the Nobel Prize, like they were going around explaining to people that, they weren't calling it fractional reserve banking. They were calling it like maturity mismatch or something. And all the interviewers like, oh, wow, what great insights. Oh, wow. So maybe if banks had the same maturity on their liabilities and assets, that might prevent future crises. Well, and there's like, yeah, this is all how do you guys not know this? But anyway, I'm just saying it's like these are things that keep getting rediscovered. And it's just kind of, I would say the Austrians in the Rothbardian tradition have been very consistent to keep the spotlight on this.
It is incredible how these things get invented by the mainstream. About 10 or 12 years ago, the editor of the American Economic Review, one of them, very prestigious job, published an article, I think it was in the JPE, Journal of Political Economy, showing that the policies of FDR during the Great Depression actually made unemployment worse. And the Austrians had been saying that for 75 years at the time or something like that. And it struck him. This is a man who had been an Ivy League educated, a PhD, teaching at UCLA for many years. And it struck him that when he taught that cartels reduce outputs, reduce production, that just might cause higher unemployment, reduce production. And then he said, well, that's what FDR did. The first New Deal was trying to reduce the production of food and reduce the production of manufacturing goods. And it's like Econ 101, and he got an article in the Journal of Political Economy that if you say it with a bunch of game theory, it sounds real. But if you say it in plain English, it doesn't. I mean, I'm always amazed at how the mainstream invents common sense, or they discover it about every 50 years or so.
Oh, hello, sorry. Hello. I don't think the Institute has any real sort of official opinion on Javier Milei, but I thought it would be interesting to maybe ask the faculty what their general attitudes are towards Milei and his presidency and see if we have any differing opinions. I think it would be interesting to hear that.
So I'll try to just be very diplomatic about it in the sense that obviously he had a big public feud with Hans Hoppe. And so for people who want to know, I just kind of refereed that. If you go to the Bob Murphy show, Hoppe versus Milei, because Milei was throwing out words like transversality conditions and stuff like that about shutting down the central bank. So my quick snapshot was I think they were talking past each other, that Hoppe was saying, if you want to stop price inflation, just stop printing more pesos. Boom, you're done. And Milei was saying, well, no, if we got rid of the central bank, there'd be hyperinflation. And what Milei meant was right now there's assets tied to the liabilities. And he thought Hoppe meant just disconnect the outstanding currency from the assets that it's tied to. And that would cause, its value. So a lot of that I think was just talking back and forth. But just talking with people there, the word that they tell me, like from my Latin American friends, is you guys in the United States do not understand. There's just a bunch of commies down there. And what he's doing is so far beyond that it's unrealistic to expect him to do anything more than he's doing. So I don't know whether that's right or not. I'm just saying that's kind of the stuff that I've been hearing.
I know what one of the things Hans Hoppe is bothered about is that apart from Milei's economic speeches and what he's done in policy. He's a neocon warmonger on foreign policy, and war is the health of the state. He calls himself a libertarian. And Hans is concerned that in Latin America, especially, people who are just learning about libertarianism will think that you're a neoconservatism and never-ending war. The policy of the American state in the past, 200 years, is what libertarians are about. And even apart from these debates on economics and banking that they've had.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for the panel.